There are moments in life when a single sentence can shatter everything you thought you knew about your relationship. For me, that moment came on a Thursday evening when my wife looked me dead in the eye and said, "All my friends have better husbands." The words hit like a sledgehammer to the chest, especially since she delivered them in front of her entire social circle during what was supposed to be a casual dinner at our house. Let me paint you the picture. We had invited her three closest friends over for dinner, something we did maybe once a month. These women had been her friends since college, and honestly, I'd never been particularly fond of them. They had this way of making everything a competition, from their kids' achievements to their vacation destinations. But my wife adored them, so I played along, being the gracious host I always was. The evening started normally enough. I'd spent the afternoon preparing a decent meal, nothing fancy, but solid comfort food that everyone seemed to enjoy. I was clearing the plates when the conversation shifted to relationships. One of her friends was complaining about her husband working late again. Another was griping about hers not being romantic enough. Typical stuff that I'd learned to tune out over the years. But then my wife joined in. "You know what?" she said, pausing to take a sip of wine. "I've been thinking about this a lot lately." The table went quiet, all eyes on her. All my friends have better husbands than mine. The silence that followed was thick enough to cut with a knife. Her friends exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable with the sudden shift in tone. But my wife wasn't done. She continued, "I mean, look at what your husbands do for you. Expensive trips, surprise gifts, constant attention. What do I get? Dinner at home, and maybe a movie on weekends." I felt every pair of eyes in the room turn to me, waiting for my reaction. Now, a lesser man might have gotten defensive, might have started listing all the things he did for his wife, might have apologized and promised to do better. But not me. Instead, I calmly finished clearing the last plate, walked into the kitchen, and came back with dessert like nothing had happened. "Dessert, anyone?" I asked with a smile that didn't quite reach my eyes. The rest of the evening crawled by like a wounded animal. Her friends tried to salvage the conversation, but the damage was done. When they finally left, my wife expected me to address what had happened. She kept shooting me these expectant looks, like she was waiting for me to either grovel or explode. Instead, I simply said goodnight and went to bed. But sleep was the last thing on my mind. As I lay there staring at the ceiling, her words kept echoing in my head. "All my friends have better husbands." The sheer audacity of it was almost impressive. She had publicly humiliated me in front of her friends, essentially announcing that I wasn't good enough, that I was somehow failing as a husband. What she didn't know was that I'd been watching these so-called perfect marriages for years. I'd seen the cracks that her friends worked so hard to hide. The forced smiles, the passive-aggressive comments, the way they talked about their husbands when they thought no one was listening. These women weren't living fairy tales. They were living elaborate performances. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became. My wife had been poisoned by comparison, fed a steady diet of other people's highlight reels until she convinced herself that everyone else had it better. She'd taken our solid, stable relationship and decided it wasn't enough because it didn't come with the bells and whistles that her friends bragged about. Well, if she wanted to see how good she had it, I was more than happy to show her. But not in the way she expected. Over the next few days, I began to change my approach. Not dramatically, mind you. I wasn't about to throw a tantrum or make grand gestures. Instead, I started pulling back. The little things I used to do without thinking, the extra effort I put into making her happy, the way I always prioritized her needs over my own, all of that gradually stopped. When she asked why I seemed distant, I simply said I was giving her space to appreciate what her friends' husbands had to offer. The confusion in her eyes was almost satisfying. She'd expected anger, arguments, maybe even an ultimatum. What she got instead was calculated indifference. Because here's the thing about respect. You can't demand it, you can't beg for it, and you definitely can't get it back by making excuses for people who don't value you. You earn it by showing that you won't tolerate being treated as anything less than you deserve. My wife had made her position clear. In her eyes, I was the consolation prize, the participation trophy in a competition where everyone else had won gold medals. Fine. If that's how she saw me, then it was time for her to experience what life would be like without that consolation prize. The game had begun, and unlike my wife, I'd been paying attention to the other players for years. I knew exactly where the bodies were buried in each of those perfect marriages. All I needed to do was decide when and how to start digging them up. After all, she wanted to compare husbands. I was about to give her friends a very detailed comparison of what they'd be losing if their better husbands suddenly weren't in the picture anymore. The beauty of being underestimated is that people let their guard down around you. For years, I'd been the quiet husband in the background while my wife's friends painted their perfect pictures. They saw me as harmless, forgettable even. What they didn't realize was that I'd been taking mental notes the entire time. The investigation began the very next day. I started with social media, something I'd never paid much attention to before, but suddenly found fascinating. These women documented everything online, and I mean everything. The constant stream of photos, check-ins, and carefully crafted posts told a story that didn't quite match the perfection they claimed at dinner parties. Take the first friend, the one who always bragged about her husband's romantic gestures. According to her Instagram, they were living a fairy tale. Expensive restaurants, surprise weekend getaways, jewelry that probably cost more than most people's cars. But if you looked closer, really looked, the cracks started to show. Her husband was tagged in photos at bars and clubs on nights when she posted about quiet evenings at home. His own social media showed him with groups of people she was never part of, including several attractive women who seemed to be regular fixtures in his life. But social media only tells you so much. I needed more concrete information, and fortunately, I knew exactly where to get it. The gym was my first stop. Her friend's husband worked out at the same place I did, though we'd never spoken beyond the occasional nod. I started timing my workouts to coincide with his, gradually striking up conversations. It didn't take long before he was complaining about his marriage, how his wife was never satisfied no matter how much money he spent on her, how he felt like a walking credit card rather than a husband. The trips, the jewelry, all of it. He said one day while we were cooling down after a particularly intense session. She posts about how romantic I am, but honestly, I'm buying her silence. Every time I mess up, every time I come home late smelling like perfume that isn't hers, I throw money at the problem until it goes away. There it was. The romantic husband was actually a serial cheater using expensive gifts as hush money. His wife wasn't living a fairy tale. She was living in denial, accepting bribes to look the other way. The second friend's husband was even easier to figure out. He worked in finance, and I happened to know someone in his company. A casual conversation over coffee revealed that he'd been struggling with gambling debts for over a year. Those expensive vacations his wife loved to brag about, they were being funded by credit cards and loans he'd taken out without her knowledge. The financial foundation of their perfect marriage was built on quicksand. But the third friend's situation was the most telling of all. Her husband seemed like the most stable of the bunch, the one who actually appeared to be present and engaged. But there was something off about their dynamic that I'd noticed during group gatherings. The way he spoke to her, the subtle put-downs disguised as jokes, the way she flinched slightly when he raised his voice. I started paying closer attention during their social interactions. What I found was a textbook case of emotional manipulation. He controlled everything. Their social calendar, their finances, even what she wore to events. The reason he seemed so attentive wasn't because he loved her. It was because he was monitoring her every move. The proof came when I overheard him on a phone call during a barbecue at their house. He was in the kitchen, thinking he was alone, berating her for talking too long to a neighbor. The language he used was degrading, threatening. When she came into the kitchen moments later, her entire demeanor had changed. She was walking on eggshells for the rest of the evening. So there it was, 3 perfect marriages that were actually disasters in disguise. Husband number 1 was a cheating narcissist. Husband number 2 was a gambling addict living a lie. Husband number 3 was an emotional abuser who'd isolated his wife from any real support system. And my wife thought these were upgrades. The irony was almost poetic. While she was busy comparing me to these men, wishing I was more like them, I was uncovering the truth about what being more like them actually meant. Did she want me to cheat on her and buy her silence with expensive gifts? Did she want me to rack up secret debts to fund a lifestyle we couldn't afford? Or maybe she wanted me to control and intimidate her into submission. Armed with this information, I had a choice to make. I could confront my wife directly, lay out everything I discovered, and hope she'd see reason. But that would be too easy, too clean. She'd made her judgment publicly, humiliated me in front of her friends. If she wanted to play comparison games, then we were going to play them properly. Besides, Simply telling her the truth wouldn't be nearly as effective as showing her. She needed to see these perfect marriages crumble on their own, needed to watch her friends' fairy tales turn into cautionary tales. Only then would she understand what she'd almost thrown away. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. I wasn't going to expose anyone directly. I didn't need to. These marriages were already ticking time bombs. They just needed the right catalyst to explode. All I had to do was create the right circumstances for the truth to come out naturally. Starting with the cheating husband, I began my work. A few carefully placed questions during our gym conversations, some strategic observations about his behavior patterns, and slowly but surely, I started planting seeds of doubt in his mind about whether his wife was as oblivious as he thought. You know, I mentioned casually one day, your wife seemed really interested in that new guy at the dinner party last week. They were talking for quite a while. It wasn't true, of course, but paranoia is a powerful thing, especially in someone who's already living a double life. If he was going to be unfaithful, he'd assume everyone else was capable of the same thing. The beauty of my approach was that I wasn't lying or manipulating anyone. I was simply creating opportunities for the truth to surface. These men had built their reputations on lies and deception. All I was doing was making sure those lies couldn't stay hidden forever. My wife, meanwhile, continued to act as if nothing had happened, as if her public humiliation of me was just another dinner conversation. She'd occasionally make comments about how her friends were so lucky to have such devoted husbands, clearly expecting me to step up my game. Instead, I continued to pull back. Not dramatically, but enough that she was starting to notice the difference. The small gestures, the extra attention, the way I used to prioritize her happiness above everything else, all of it was becoming a memory. When she asked why I seemed different, I'd simply smile and say, "Just giving you space to appreciate what you have." The confusion in her eyes was delicious. She wanted a fight, wanted drama, wanted something she could point to and say, "See, this is why I'm unsatisfied." What she got instead was a husband who was finally done being taken for granted and a front row seat to watch her friends' perfect marriages fall apart one by one. The thing about planting seeds is that you need patience to watch them grow. But when they're watered with paranoia and fertilized with guilty consciences, the growth rate becomes surprisingly fast. My first target was the cheating husband, and he was making my job almost too easy. During our gym sessions, I'd started noticing how he'd check his phone constantly, always angling the screen away from anyone nearby. Classic behavior of someone with secrets to hide. So I decided to feed his paranoia. Funny thing happened at the grocery store yesterday. I mentioned casually while we were stretching after a workout. "Saw your wife there with some guy I didn't recognize. They seemed pretty comfortable with each other, laughing and all that. Probably just a friend, right?" The look that crossed his face was priceless. Pure panic, quickly masked, but not quite fast enough. "What did he look like?" he asked, trying to sound casual and failing miserably. I shrugged. Tall, dark hair, well-dressed. They were in the wine section together, seemed to know exactly what they were looking for. I paused, pretending to think. Actually, now that I think about it, she was dressed up pretty nice for grocery shopping. But hey, maybe she just likes to look good, you know? That was all it took. I could practically see the wheels turning in his head, imagining scenarios, questioning every interaction his wife had when he wasn't around. The beautiful irony was that he was experiencing exactly what he'd been putting her through for months, except in his case, it was all in his imagination. But I wasn't done with him yet. A few days later, I made sure to run into him at the coffee shop near his office. "Hey, weird coincidence," I said, approaching his table. "Wasn't that your wife I saw having lunch at that little Italian place downtown yesterday? She was with the same guy from the grocery store." His grip tightened on his coffee cup. "What time was this?" "Around noon, maybe 12:30? They looked like they were having a deep conversation." I sat down uninvited. "Look, I don't want to overstep, but as a friend, I thought you should know. I mean, if my wife was having lunch with the same guy twice in 1 week." I let the sentence hang there, watching as his paranoia ate him alive from the inside. The truth was, I'd never seen his wife with anyone. But a guilty conscience doesn't need facts, it just needs possibilities. Meanwhile, I was working on husband number 2, the gambling addict. This one required a different approach. Instead of feeding paranoia, I needed to create financial pressure that would force his secret into the open. I knew he frequented a particular sports bar that had illegal betting in the back room. It wasn't hard to figure out. The place had a reputation, and I'd seen him there enough times to establish a pattern. So I started showing up, not to gamble, but to drink and watch games like any normal person would. It took 3 visits before he noticed me. "Hey, don't I know you?" he asked, slightly drunk and overly friendly. "You're married to one of my wife's friends," I replied. "We've met at dinner parties." That opened the floodgates. Within an hour, he was telling me about his system for beating the odds, how he was just one big win away from paying everything off. The classic gambler's delusion, and he was living it fully. "The thing is," he confided, ordering another round, "my wife thinks we're doing great financially. She has no idea how close we are to losing everything." He laughed bitterly. "But once I hit this next bet, we'll be golden. Then I can stop." I nodded sympathetically. "What happens if you don't hit it?" His face darkened. "That's not an option. I've got too much riding on this." That's when I knew exactly what to do. I started mentioning, casually and in different contexts, how his wife had been talking about some expensive purchases she was planning. A new car, a kitchen renovation, maybe a vacation to Europe. None of it was true, but it didn't need to be. All it needed to do was add pressure to a man who was already drowning. She mentioned something about wanting to surprise you with a weekend in Vegas. I told him during one of our chance encounters. Said she'd already started looking at flights. The panic in his eyes was immediate. Vegas was the last place a gambling addict needed to be, especially one whose wife didn't know about his problem. More importantly, any surprise expense would expose his carefully hidden financial situation. The third husband, the emotional abuser, required the most delicate touch. Men like him thrive on control, and the key to breaking that control is to introduce chaos they can't manage. I started by simply being present more often when he was around. During group gatherings, I made a point of engaging his wife in conversation, asking her opinions on things, treating her like the intelligent woman she was instead of the decoration he'd turned her into. "What do you think about the new restaurant downtown?" I'd ask her directly, making sure he could hear. "You always have great taste in food." It was subtle, but effective. Every time I treated her with basic respect and consideration, it highlighted how differently he treated her. I could see her starting to notice the contrast, starting to remember what it felt like to be valued for more than just her obedience. But the real breakthrough came during a barbecue at our house. He was being particularly controlling that day, cutting her off mid-sentence, making decisions for her without asking, the usual pattern. So I decided to test his limits. "You know," I said loudly enough for the whole group to hear, "your wife was telling me about that book she's reading. Sounds fascinating. What was it again?" I looked directly at her, ignoring his obvious discomfort with someone else engaging his wife in conversation. She glanced nervously at him before answering, but she did answer. And for the next 10 minutes, we had a perfectly normal conversation about literature while he stood there, unable to intervene without looking like the controlling freak he was. The effect was immediate. She started speaking up more during the evening, expressing opinions, even disagreeing with him on minor points. Each time she did, I could see his anger building, his need to reassert control becoming more obvious to everyone present. By the end of the night, even my wife had noticed how strangely he was acting. "He seemed really tense tonight," she mentioned as we were cleaning up, almost like he was angry about something. "Maybe he's just stressed," I replied innocently. Some men don't handle it well when they feel like they're losing control. The seeds were planted, watered, and beginning to sprout. All 3 of these perfect marriages were showing cracks, and the best part was that none of it could be traced back to me. I wasn't spreading rumors or lies. I was simply creating situations where the truth couldn't stay hidden. My wife, meanwhile, was starting to notice my changed behavior more acutely. The man who used to jump at her every request was now politely, but firmly setting boundaries. When she complained about something, instead of immediately trying to fix it, I'd simply say, "That sounds frustrating. What are you going to do about it?" The shift in dynamic was subtle but profound. She was used to being the center of attention, the priority that everything else revolved around. Now she was being treated like an equal partner who was expected to handle her own problems and contribute equally to solutions. "You've been acting strange lately," she accused one evening after I declined to rearrange my schedule to accommodate one of her last-minute plans. "Strange how?" I asked, genuinely curious. "Distant, like you don't care anymore." I looked at her for a long moment before responding. I care exactly as much as I'm cared for in return. No more, no less. The confusion in her eyes was genuine. She'd become so accustomed to unconditional attention that conditional attention felt like rejection. She couldn't understand that respect and effort needed to be mutual to be sustainable. But understanding was coming, whether she was ready for it or not. Because while she was busy trying to figure out why her husband was changing, her friends' perfect marriages were about to start falling apart in spectacular fashion. And when they did, she was going to get a front row seat to see exactly what those better husbands were really like when the masks came off. The first domino fell on a Tuesday morning, and it fell hard. I was having coffee when my phone buzzed with a text from my wife. Emergency at Rebecca's. Need to go over there now. Rebecca was the friend married to the cheating husband, and I had a pretty good idea what kind of emergency this was going to be. Apparently, Rebecca's husband had become so paranoid about her supposed affair that he'd started following her. The problem was, in his desperation to catch her cheating, he'd gotten sloppy with his own activities. While trailing his innocent wife to a perfectly normal lunch with her sister, he'd left his own phone unlocked at home. Rebecca had returned to find dozens of text messages from multiple women, including photos that left absolutely nothing to the imagination. The romantic husband who showered her with expensive gifts wasn't just cheating. He was running what amounted to a small harem. When my wife came home that evening, she was shell-shocked. "I can't believe it," she kept repeating. "All those trips, all those presents, all that romance. It was all just guilt money." I nodded sympathetically while internally celebrating the beauty of paranoia-induced self-destruction. "That's terrible. Rebecca must be devastated." "She is. She's talking about taking him for everything in the divorce." Apparently, she'd been suspicious for months but convinced herself she was being paranoid because of all the sweet things he did. My wife shook her head. "How could she not know? Sometimes people see what they want to see," I replied. "It's easier to believe in a beautiful lie than accept an ugly truth." The irony wasn't lost on me. My wife was describing her friend's willful blindness while being completely blind to her own situation. The second marriage imploded just 3 days later, and this one was even more spectacular. The gambling addict had finally cracked under the pressure I'd been carefully applying. Between his existing debts and the imaginary expenses I'd convinced him his wife was planning, he'd made one final, desperate bet to try to solve everything at once. He lost. Badly. The creditors came calling the next morning, showing up at his house while his wife was home alone. She answered the door to find two very large, very serious men demanding immediate payment for debts she didn't even know existed. When she called her husband in hysterics, he had to come clean about everything. The gambling, the debts, the fact that they were about 3 weeks away from losing their house. All those vacations she'd been bragging about, they were funded by money that didn't exist. My wife got the phone call during dinner. We sat there listening to her friend sob about how her perfect financial situation was actually a house of cards built on lies and borrowed money. "I don't understand," my wife said after hanging up. "He always seems so stable, so responsible. How could he hide something like this?" "Addiction makes people do desperate things," I observed. "It's amazing how convincing someone can be when their survival depends on it." 2 down, 1 to go. The third marriage took a little longer to crack, but when it did, it was the most satisfying of all. The emotional abuser had been growing increasingly agitated as his wife became more confident and outspoken. My simple act of treating her like a human being with valid opinions had reminded her of what respect felt like, and she was starting to expect it at home too. The breaking point came during a dinner party at their house. His wife had prepared an elaborate meal, and when one of the guests complimented her cooking, she actually smiled and said thank you instead of deflecting to her husband. That's when he made his mistake. In front of everyone, he snapped at her for showing off and told her to go check on the kitchen instead of standing around accepting praise she didn't deserve. The room went dead silent. Even by the low standards of this group, it was shockingly cruel and inappropriate. But instead of the usual embarrassed compliance, his wife did something different. She looked him dead in the eye and said, "No, just that." One word, but it carried the weight of years of suppressed dignity. His face went red with rage. "Excuse me." I said no. "I'm not going to the kitchen. I'm not standing here to be insulted. And I'm certainly not going to apologize for being complimented on my hard work." The explosion that followed was everything I'd hoped for and more. In front of 6 witnesses, he revealed exactly who he really was. The shouting, the verbal abuse, the threats, the attempt to physically intimidate her into submission. It was a masterclass in toxic masculinity, and everyone in that room got to see it in all its ugly glory. The most beautiful part was watching the other guests' faces as they realized what they'd been witnessing all these years. The jokes that weren't really jokes, the way she always seemed nervous around him, the control he exercised over every aspect of her life. It all made sense now. When he finally stormed out, his wife turned to the room and said quietly, "I think I need a divorce lawyer. 3 perfect marriages, 3 spectacular failures. And my wife had witnessed every single collapse. The aftermath was fascinating to watch. My wife spent the next week in a daze, trying to process how completely wrong she'd been about her friends' situations. The women she'd held up as examples of marital success were now dealing with infidelity, financial ruin, and emotional abuse. I just don't understand," she said one evening, curled up on the couch with a glass of wine. "They all seemed so happy, so perfect. How did I get it so wrong?" "Maybe you weren't seeing their marriages," I suggested gently. "Maybe you were seeing the performances they put on for everyone else." She looked at me with new eyes, and I could see the wheels turning. For the first time since her devastating dinner party comment, she was starting to question her own judgment. "The things I said that night," she began hesitantly. "About you, about us. What about them? I was comparing you to men who turned out to be liars, cheaters, and abusers." Her voice was small, ashamed. "I thought they were better husbands because they were more flashy, more dramatic in their gestures." I remained silent, letting her work through the realization on her own. "You never cheated on me. You never lied to me about money. You never made me feel small or worthless." She was crying now, and I stood there in front of everyone and said they were better than you. The moment hung between us like a bridge she wasn't sure she was allowed to cross. She'd publicly humiliated me, questioned my worth as a husband, and held up 3 disastrous marriages as examples of what she wanted instead. Now she knew the truth. The question was, what was she going to do about it? "I'm sorry," she whispered, and for the first time in weeks, it sounded genuine. But sorry wasn't going to be enough. Not this time. She'd learned an important lesson about assumptions and comparisons, but I had a few more lessons to teach her about consequences and respect. After all, an apology without changed behavior is just manipulation with better PR. The apology hung in the air between us like smoke from a dying fire. My wife sat there, tears streaming down her face, waiting for me to absolve her of the humiliation she'd put me through. But forgiveness, real forgiveness, isn't something you can just hand out like party favors. "Sorry for what, exactly?" I asked, settling back in my chair. She blinked, clearly expecting immediate acceptance of her apology. "For what I said that night. For comparing you to them. For making you feel like you weren't enough." "Making me feel?" I let out a short laugh. "You didn't make me feel anything. You publicly announced that I was inferior to 3 men who, as it turns out, are a cheater, a gambling addict, and an abuser. That's not about feelings. That's about respect." Her face crumpled. I know. I was wrong about everything. I see that now. Do you? Because a week ago, those were your role models. A week ago, you wanted me to be more like them." I leaned forward. "Tell me, which quality specifically did you want me to adopt? The infidelity? The financial deception? Or maybe the emotional abuse?" "That's not fair," she protested. "I didn't know about any of that. You didn't want to know. There's a difference." I stood up, pacing to the window. "You saw expensive gifts and assumed romance. You saw exotic trips and assumed love. You saw control and assumed strength. You never bothered to look deeper because the surface was shiny enough." She was sobbing now, but I wasn't finished. "Here's what really bothers me," I continued, my voice calm but cutting. "It's not just that you compared me to other men. It's that you did it publicly, in front of your friends, in our home. You humiliated me as a power play to establish some kind of social hierarchy where I was at the bottom. I didn't mean it like that." "Yes, you did. You absolutely did. Because if you'd had concerns about our marriage, if you genuinely wanted me to be different, you would have talked to me privately. Instead, you chose to embarrass me in front of an audience." The truth of it hit her like a physical blow. I could see the moment she realized I was right, that her public declaration hadn't been about improving our relationship. It had been about putting me in my place. "So now what?" she asked quietly. Now you learn what consequences look like. I turned back to face her. You wanted to see how you compared to your friends? Well, now you can see exactly how that feels. Her eyes widened. What do you mean? I mean you're about to find out what it's like to be alone while you figure out whether you actually want to be married to me, or if you were just settling because you thought you couldn't do better. You're leaving me? I'm giving you exactly what you asked for. Space to evaluate your options. Time to see if there really are better husbands out there than the one you publicly dismissed. The panic in her voice was immediate. But I don't want space. I want to work this out. That's convenient. Now that your friends' marriages have imploded and you're facing the possibility of being the single one in the group, suddenly what we have looks more appealing. She opened her mouth to deny it, then closed it again. We both knew I was right. Here's how this is going to work, I said, my voice steady and final. You're going to take some time to really think about whether you want to be married to me, not as a backup plan or a safe choice, but because you actually value what we have. And I'm going to take some time to decide whether I want to be married to someone who sees me as a consolation prize. How long? As long as it takes. Maybe a week, maybe a month, maybe longer. But here's the thing. If we do decide to work this out, it's going to be on completely different terms. No more taking me for granted. No more public disrespect. No more comparisons to other people's marriages. I moved toward the door, then paused. And just so we're clear, this isn't a negotiation. This isn't me asking for changes or hoping you'll do better. This is me telling you that the version of our marriage where you felt comfortable humiliating me is over. Permanently. The door closed behind me with a quiet click, leaving her alone with the consequences of her choices and the wreckage of everything she'd thought she wanted. 3 weeks passed before she reached out. 3 weeks of radio silence while she watched her friends navigate the wreckage of their collapsed marriages. Rebecca was deep in divorce proceedings, discovering new affairs every time her lawyer dug deeper. The gambling addict's wife had moved back in with her parents after losing the house. The abuse victim was in therapy, slowly rebuilding a sense of self-worth that had been systematically destroyed. When my wife finally called, her voice was different. Smaller somehow, but more genuine than it had been in years. "Can we talk?" she asked. "Are you ready to have a real conversation, or are you just lonely?" The pause told me everything I needed to know. She'd been thinking, really thinking, about what she wanted versus what she actually had. We met at a coffee shop downtown, neutral territory where neither of us had the advantage of familiarity. She looked tired but more alert than I'd seen her in months, like someone who'd finally stopped sleepwalking through their own life. "I've been watching what happened to them," she said without preamble. "Rebecca, the others. And I keep thinking about how I held them up as examples of what I wanted. And now I see what I almost threw away." She met my eyes directly. "I humiliated you because I was embarrassed about having a stable, honest marriage instead of a dramatic one. I confused dysfunction with passion, control with strength." I sipped my coffee, waiting for more. "You never cheated on me, never lied about money, never made me feel worthless. But somehow I convinced myself that made you boring instead of trustworthy." Her voice cracked slightly. "I was an idiot." "Yes, you were." She flinched at the bluntness, but didn't argue. "I don't know how to fix this." You start by understanding that this isn't about fixing anything. This is about building something completely new. The marriage we had before, where you could disrespect me publicly and expect me to just take it. That's dead. I know. Do you? Because knowing it intellectually and accepting it emotionally are two different things. You got comfortable treating me like a safe option you could take for granted. That comfort is gone forever. She nodded, tears starting to fall. "What do you need from me?" "I need you to prove that you understand what respect looks like. Not just saying you're sorry, but showing me through your actions that you value what we have instead of constantly measuring it against someone else's highlight reel." "How do I do that?" "You figure it out. I'm not going to give you a checklist to follow. Either you understand why what you did was wrong and you change your behavior accordingly, or you don't, and we both move on with our lives." We sat in silence for a few minutes, the weight of potential endings hanging between us. "I want to try," she said finally. "Not because I'm scared of being alone, but because I finally understand what I actually have with you." "And what's that?" "Partnership. Honesty. Someone who respects me enough to tell me the truth, even when it's uncomfortable." She wiped her eyes. "I want to come home." I studied her face, looking for signs of performance or manipulation. What I saw instead was someone who'd been forced to confront some hard truths about herself and didn't like what she'd found. One chance, I said finally. Not because you deserve it, but because I want to see if you can actually change. But understand this. The first time you disrespect me, the first time you make me feel like a backup plan, the first time you compare our marriage to someone else's fantasy, we're done. Permanently. I understand. I hope you do. Because I'm not the same man who would accept being humiliated for the sake of keeping the peace. That version of me is gone. 6 months later, we were stronger than we'd ever been. Not because she'd learned to perform respect, but because she'd learned to actually feel it. The woman who'd once publicly dismissed me as inferior now introduced me to new people as someone she was proud to be married to. The transformation wasn't instant or easy. There were moments when old patterns tried to resurface, when she'd catch herself about to make a comparison or take something for granted. But she'd stop herself, correct course, and actively choose a different response. Her friends, meanwhile, were learning their own hard lessons. Rebecca had discovered that romance without respect is just expensive manipulation. The gambling addict's wife realized that financial security built on lies is no security at all. The abuse victim understood that control disguised as care is still abuse. They'd all been so busy envying each other's surface-level presentations that none of them had bothered to look at the foundations their marriages were built on. When those foundations crumbled, they finally understood what my wife was starting to learn. That real partnership isn't about grand gestures or dramatic displays. It's about trust, honesty, and mutual respect maintained through countless small choices every single day. My wife learned to value substance over spectacle, stability over sensation. And I learned that sometimes the only way to save a marriage is to be willing to lose it. In the end, she didn't get a better husband. She got a better understanding of the one she already had.